The views and opinions heard on this show do not necessarily reflect the views of the host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Real Spiritual Talk Radio.
My breathing had stopped for so long that my heart actually ended up stopping.
You saw what I did. You said that I was going to die.
And then I remember being gone. I wasn't there anymore.
I sort of lifted up about 6 feet above my body.
A pinprick of light appeared and came rushing toward me faster than the speed of light.
And then this light, all of a sudden it was all completely around me.
He says, I am God. Yes, I am real.
The main message was loving yourself and loving others.
It was clearly shown to me.
It was really hard to put into words. It felt like I had been there before.
It was just this very personal, impersonal, unconditional love.
Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Real Spiritual Talk Radio. I am your host, Lamont Gates, bringing you the world of faith, metaphysicality, and spirituality. Today, my guest was able to witness what lies beyond on various occasions, but this only strengthened her quest for that same knowledge she encountered beyond. Let's get it started. Ladies and gentlemen, joining me via Skype all the way in Australia is near-death experiencer Liljana Millutin. Liljana, welcome to Real Spiritual Talk Radio.
Hello, Lamont. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be talking to you. It's a subject that I've been passionate about for obvious reasons for decades now.
Awesome. I too am passionate about this topic, as are the listeners of this show. So let's get some historical context before we get into your near-death experience. How was religion and or spirituality, for example, introduced to you as a child?
Good question. My upbringing was in a communist country and religion was not to be spoken of. I did have two bishops in my family on the Roman Catholic side and on the Orthodox side. My great-grandfather on my father's side was an Orthodox equivalent bishop. However, I was not brought up religious. My grandparents, my maternal grandparents, brought me up completely void of any kind of spiritual education, really. But I was aware that they themselves were very spiritual, so not necessarily religious, but very spiritual people. For various reasons, I kind of got little hints, and I was brought up by my maternal grandparents till I was 11. So not really. And I used to have extended talks with my uncle about God and the afterlife. He actually passed 2 days ago. And I think his purpose for bringing these discussions up was because he feared that there was nothing. He wasn't religious. And as most people I've encountered who haven't had an NDE but are interested in it, are interested because they fear what happens when the body dies. So as a teenager, I had a lot of those discussions, and I always asserted that I was an atheist, meaning that I did not believe in God. However, my definition of that was that I did not believe in God of religion, how religion identifies what God is or who God is. I'd never agreed with the perspective where God was personified. It just wasn't logical to my analytical, scientific mind.
So if you did not believe in a religious God, yet having various conversations with your uncle about God's existence, would you label yourself an agnostic at the time or some sort?
No, not agnostic. I mean, agnostic means that it's a belief that we cannot know God. At that point, I think instinctively, I knew that we can know something beyond this physical reality, because I kind of felt it, and I had visions since I was a child, way before my NDEs. So No, definitely not agnostic. And I've posed this question to people in the past. What would you call me? Am I an atheist, agnostic? Am I a spiritualist? How would you define my beliefs? I do believe in God, but not the God of religion.
And so to clarify, as a child until now, you do believe in a God, just not the religious version of such.
Absolutely.
Got you. Got that squared away with. Well, why don't we go into your actual experience? Rather, what was it that brought your near-death experience forth?
Well, I've actually had three since I was 16. The first one was at 16. It was an overdose, a deliberate overdose. And I ended up in hospital. That was in 78. And I was actually resuscitated in the hospital because I medically died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that there are two types of medical death. One is non-clinical, where only breathing and heartbeat stops, and the clinical death, which is a legal requirement for pronouncing somebody dead, which is breathing, heartbeat, and neural activity in the brain have stopped. So I wasn't clinically dead, and I was resuscitated in the ER. The second one was only 2 years later. I was working night shift in my fiance's family's factory to help my single mum put me through university. So that was in 1980. And I always wondered why I did this. I mean, I knew better, but I connected the plus and the minus on the forging machine with a screwdriver, and I got electrocuted. And I was thrown in the air 3 meters or so into this puddle on the floor on concrete. When I saw my body from above, from kind of underneath the ceiling of the factory, when I came back, it was pretty quick, that one. And when I came back, I went to the office and they just said, no, there's no way you could have survived that. I was standing on a wooden pallet. I was wearing rubber-soled shoes. I had gloves on and holding, obviously, the plastic end of the screwdriver. But third-phase electricity in industrial settings is extremely powerful. They did not believe that I could have been electrocuted. And when I said to my fiance at the time, so how do you explain my back is wet? And my backside wasn't. So it was the way I flew through the air. And he looked at me and he just went, I don't believe this. My third one was years later in 98 due to heart issues. And only recently, funny enough, last year, the doctors have come to the conclusion that it's likely, my heart issues are likely, due to the electrocution, which I never connected. I never realized that was possibly the reason for my heart issues. And my heart issues are linked to electrical impulses. It's called the Brugada syndrome, which means the electrical impulses are not working properly, so they're not kind of telling the heart to work normally.
So let me ask, just to clarify once again, you're saying you died 3 times?
Yes.
So let's discuss what you actually encountered, or did you actually encounter something in all 3 deaths?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Great. Let's begin with the first one.
Yeah, the first thing I recall after losing consciousness in a park was looking at my body on an OR table with the doctor and 3 nurses. One tall, slim male nurse, which was actually unusual back in the 70s, and the doctor ordering that tall, slim nurse, which is why he stood out for me as well, was to give me epinephrine 3 times and to get the pedals ready as well. And I recalled thinking, oh, wow, that's my body. And the moment I thought that, I went through what felt like the molecular structure of concrete. And I remember thinking as that was happening, oh, wow, this is what the molecules of concrete look like. So I went through the floors of the hospital. I don't know how many, but there was more than a couple. And once I was above the hospital, I saw the helipad on top of it. And the other thought was, oh, they land helicopters on top here. The next thing from that moment was I was in this really bright, misty place. In a bit of a distance, I saw quite a few silhouettes of people. I couldn't discern if they were men or women or what the dress was, but I knew they were people. And as I kind of had a sense of looking around, a tunnel appeared, kind of like with swirling walls. And at the end of the tunnel was a light. And in that light was a silhouette, but very well defined, of my maternal grandmother who brought me up, who died when I was 12 of cancer, so 4 years prior. And my impulse was to go to her. I used to call her my second mum as a child. And as I had that impulse to go to her, this little girl of about 8, maybe 9, appeared. What I describe as next to me, but I was not aware of a body. I had no body that I was aware of. It was just awareness. And the girl looked really interesting. She wasn't anybody, I mean, I can still see her in my mind's eye when I speak about this. She had dark skin, absolutely beautiful, big brown doe-like eyes. Her hair looked like it had been cut with a knife, really rough, short, sort of just above shoulder length. And she was wearing a really rough linen dress tied around the waist with a rope. And as I looked at this girl, she smiled and she said, "Not yet." And the next thing I know, I was in bed, and at the foot of my bed, hospital bed, at the foot of my bed was the doctor who I first saw from below the ceiling of the OR with a clipboard in her hand. And the first thing that I said or asked was, "What is epinephrine?" And she looked up and her jaw literally dropped. And she said, "Why do you ask that?" And I said, "Well, why did you tell that tall male nurse to give me epinephrine 3 times?" And she just stared at me, literally stared at me, her eyes wide open. She dropped the clipboard and she just kept saying, "How do you know that? How could you know that?" I'm getting goosebumps as I talk about this now.
Yeah, and it's very common based on the out-of-body experience which you're describing, which usually occurs prior to the more transcendental near-death experience. And they're able to see and hear with clear visuals and auditory senses what's going on around them in the hospital, which amazes doctors as to how someone clinically dead could have described events so perfectly with detail.
Absolutely. And I kind of panicked. I was always very curious. I do have medical professionals in the family, so I was always in the habit of asking, if I take this medication, what will it do? If I don't take it, what happens? And so I wanted to know, what were you doing to me? What is epinephrine? And she was stumped and wouldn't answer me. And then I said, I was getting scared. I'm thinking, well, what could possibly be this medication be? And she said, "Oh, I'll get someone to come and talk to you." And sadly, the person she sent to talk to me, the woman was quite young. She must have been an intern, was a psychiatrist. And it's kind of symptomatic of what happened to me afterwards as well when I started to talk about it. And then I shut up for almost 3 decades. I just stopped talking about my experiences. At the end of about almost an hour of asking me lots of questions, I asked, and during which I asked her, "So what is epinephrine?" And she just kept saying, "We'll get to that." And was asking a lot of questions about me personally, what I had done, why, what was going on in my life, etc. And in the end, I kind of said, "So you're going to tell me what epinephrine is? What was going on in the OR?" And she said, "They were trying to revive you. You were actually dead." The interesting thing was that a 16-year-old, given that message, I was not scared. I was not stumped. It was kind of like, oh, okay. It just kind of the whole experience in that moment felt, okay, that makes sense, and it was all fine. But Dr. Moody's book had only been out, I believe, for about 2 or so years. At that point, it wasn't very popular, and it was only years that I came across it, and pieces started to fall into place, basically.
That's actually the same book that got me into near-death experiences in general and doing what we're doing now. So talk to us about your second experience.
Well, it was very quick. The only thing that I experienced after getting that electric shock was seeing my body, as I said, on the concrete floor some meters away from the pallet and the machine that I was working on. And I looked at it, and again, it sort of felt, oh, okay, so I'm not in the body anymore. What now? And then the next thing was I came to on the ground and got up and went to the office and told them what had happened, because it was night shift, so there was only about, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4 of us in the factory.
Did it feel familiar as the first experience?
Absolutely felt familiar. But it was very short version of what had happened before. And it didn't faze me. It really did upset me that they kept saying, no, you couldn't have survived that, basically questioning my truthfulness. And I'm big on that. I'm very much against lies and all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah. And when I was talking to my friends afterwards about that, I ostracized some of them. And it's interesting how the psychiatrist that was sent to me in the hospital kind of foreshadowed what would happen later in my life. I was ostracized and called crazy. So, I was aware of kids in high school, for example, going around calling me crazy and a witch. And of course, that shut me up pretty quickly. The second one happened, 2 years later. I did talk to my fiance at the time, and he was incredulous, and he just kept saying, no, that can't be possible. And, there's, as you'd be aware, and the listeners probably would be aware, this is something that's extremely difficult to confirm.
Exactly. It's like a belief in God. How do you prove God's existence? In this case, it's an experience, but it's your experience. I still did not experience it for myself. But what confirms near-death experiences, for me at least, as being legitimate is the sheer generalization of them. For example, on every single continent, perhaps except Antarctica.
There's lots of people in Antarctica.
Right. Mostly scientists. But it transcends people from all life walks, irregardless of race, sex, culture, religion, age, sexual orientation, etc., all producing very similar accounts. In fact, that was the name of Dr. Moody's subtitle of Life After Life, an investigation into the remarkable similarity of experience. But take us into your third experience. What was that like?
That happened after dinner one evening. I had just cleaned up the kitchen after dinner and went to join my husband on the couch just to relax for a little while and chat. And my heart started to play up. And I felt nauseous and a very unpleasant feeling in the chest. And I said to him, I'm just going to go outside to get a bit of fresh air, a bit of cool. I'm not feeling great. Something's not quite right. And he looked at me and said, okay. And he stayed inside. I went out onto the back terrace, sat down on the retaining wall. And the next thing I know, I was in a black space. Now, it's interesting. People have said to me, you must have fainted, lost consciousness. Well, yeah, I did lose consciousness. But I mean, when you faint, you're not aware, and I've fainted plenty of times as a kid. You're not aware of what's going on around you by any stretch of imagination. But I was aware of this black space, and I recall thinking, wow, am I in the universe somewhere? And as I thought that, these pinpricks of light began to appear all around. And again, I was disembodied. There was no sense of a body, just a sense of heightened awareness. People have often asked me, how does that compare to dreams or hallucinations? Dreams and hallucinations are surreal. Near-death experience for me was hyper-real. Everything was heightened to an unimaginable level. And I had a sense of looking around, even though there was nobody to turn around and look or eyes. And then I came back because I was being resuscitated. And when I came back, I was sort of back because I was just above my body. So not like in the previous two instances, I was quite high above the body, like just under the ceiling. In this instance, I was right above my body. And my husband's face was in my face, basically. So I was kind of in his hair almost, if you like. Really strange. And I thought, oh, wow, what's happening? And then I went again. And I felt like I went through kind of like a soap bubble. It was that sense, when you push very gently at the membrane of a soap bubble, you can just feel the membrane before it bursts. And that's kind of how it felt. It felt like these strange sort of veils that I went through, and I went through two. And again, I was looking around thinking, so where in the universe am I? Where is our solar system? I couldn't recognize anything. In fact, everything looked kind of the same size, all the lights. So there was no solar systems of any shape or form. And kind of thinking, so there must all be suns, but very distant. And I wondered about, I had studied architecture in university, and I was always fascinated by ancient Egyptian architecture because we still can't explain it. Thinking, I wonder if that is why ancient Egyptians believed they become the sun or a sun. And then I was back again, and same scenario. It was just above my body, so I could kind of see my body, but I was sort of just next to or above my husband's head, who was trying to resuscitate me. And then I went again. And then I went through 3 of these kind of membrane, I call them gates, that seem to close behind you as you go through them. Really strange sensation. And in that kind of space, what I perceived, or what I began to be aware of, was this flood of thoughts and then emotions. And it was a tsunami. It was overwhelming, that sense of being aware of all these thoughts and feelings. And it was interesting that in the moment that I became aware of them, I was also aware that these belong to every single human who has ever lived. When I kind of went, so what is this? I was told home. And then I came back. And I came back, and my husband obviously was relieved. And I remember sitting up. I was lying down on the tiles on the back porch. And I said, I need to get into a bathtub of cold water. And we went into the bathroom, and he started to pour the water, but warm. And I said, no, cold. And he said, you're crazy. It is cold. And I said, no, I need cold water. I don't want to go back again. I've spent all these decades since 98 seriously researching not just the phenomenon, but the nature of consciousness from the perspective of science, particularly neuroscience, quantum physics. I had also looked into, actually, my original field of study was psychology. My dad was a psychologist, and really began to look into the bibliographies of books. And that way I went broader and further back in time as well. So I went into mysticism, ancient philosophy. But what the most interesting thing that happened during that last near-death experience was this incredible information dump about the nature of the soul. And to me, the soul is a type of consciousness. I don't want to just say consciousness because it's easily confused with kind of human awareness. Mathematical formulas explained, Einstein's mass equivalence formula explained. I mean, I was not a physicist or studied physics. And initially after that, when I started researching these fields, bits and pieces I found confirmations of. But the most interesting thing was that, and I wrote it all down, all of this information I wrote down, and it's the basis of a book I'm in the process of writing at the moment. What happened, though, in the days following that near death and weeks and months, I would talk to my husband about this information. And on an instinctive level, he recognized it, interesting enough. But then I'd get all excited because somewhere in the news, months later or a year later, or a couple of years later, there'd be an announcement about a scientific discovery. And my husband would say, why are you getting all excited about this? You told me about this last year. And I said, you don't understand. I had no way of knowing this last year. This was like nowhere in the media last year. This confirms what I've been saying. And after a while, he said to me, please stop telling me. It scares me. which really affected our relationship, and we were separated for 2 years as a result. So I understand when people don't want to talk about their near-death experiences.
So what would you say to those who may fear death or may not believe anything exists outside of this materialist world?
Yes, that's a very tricky one. I mean, for me, my NDEs confirmed my beliefs that God is not a being or an entity. It's a fundamental, universal conscious force that underlies absolutely everything in the known and unknown universe, so beyond this 3D physical reality. What would I say to someone who may fear death? I still don't know really what I can say to someone to appease their fear other than share my experience. Only the body dies, and our belief determines how we experience the afterlife. Maybe because I was an atheist, I didn't see any deities.
Perhaps you were within the deity itself. As you stated, God is a conscious force of both known and unknown universes.
And Lamont, one message that I can probably pass on that I received during my last NDE was that the all are the one. We are the all of the oversoul. We make it up. We are its extensions. We carry its essence. It's what gives the physical body life. And when you look into different religious teachings, it's in there. Bits and pieces of truth are in religious teachings. It's just that overall I have an issue.
Father, I am in you as they are in me, as Jesus said to God and about his disciples, right?
Absolutely.
Liljana, I want to thank you for those fascinating accounts, as you had 3 of them. And I'm sure listeners will get a lot out of your accounts, as I personally found them engaging both spiritually and scientifically.
Well, I hope so. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about it, Lamont. I hope that when my book is out next year, probably towards the end of next year, it will help a lot of people who fear death.
Thank you.
You're more than welcome, Lamont, and thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Liljana Millutin. And I want to thank you all for tuning in to another episode of Real Spiritual Talk Radio, the broadcast that is highly interested in becoming more enlightened spiritually by near-death experience accounts. Please find me on my Facebook page, Real Spiritual Talk Radio, or find me on my YouTube channel. You can type in my name, Lamont Gates, and both platforms you will find past shows and cutting room floor videos that are still being completed and uploaded. And with that said, once again, I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you've all been truly spiritually enlightened. And with that, Real Spiritual Talk Radio is now signing off.